This panel is about the future of Europe seen from the US and Asia. So just as with the very short introduction, I will tell you a few words about how we in Europe here see the United States and China. I know you're not from China. We see these two giants as two great rival superpowers engaging in a new great power competition over our heads. And there's even a darker image, in fact, which is that some European countries, some member states of the European Union are being actually used as pawns in this competition, which could destroy the whole multilateralist international order on which the European Union is based. You know, it's funny, I was listening to the previous panels and everybody loves the European Union, but somehow they all try to divide us. Maybe they like it so much that they would like to have several European Unions. So, Kishore Mahbubani, you're not from China, as I said, you're from Singapore, and you're probably the most famous Singaporean diplomat. And John Allen, I guess that you don't necessarily agree with every decision that your president takes. But you are both astute observers and very experienced practitioners of security issues and diplomacy. So we're eager to hear your views on how Europe is seen from where you stand in Asia and in the United States. I think the way we're going to work is that each of you is going to make some preliminary remarks, short, because we don't have much time and we're already running late, but this is Paris, so it's okay. And then we'll engage in a discussion about this very interesting and hot topic. So, General, why don't you start?
Thank you very much. It is wonderful to be here, to be a guest of IFRI, which is a towering think tank in the world, one we have great respect for at Brookings. It's great to be back in France. I have such great affection for this country, having served with your military on many occasions. And I sadly don't speak the language. That's my fault. But I noticed in the last panel when we heard l'Amérique or les États-Unis, people were laughing. And I'm not quite sure, someone will have to tell me later why that was so funny. I'll make a couple of points. One is that there is often the view of the United States government with regard to Europe. And then there is the view of Americans with respect to Europe. And I think it's important to recognize that there is a difference. And I think we have seen that there have been some difficulties, certainly with this administration, with respect to understanding the Europe writ large, the strength of the EU as an entity. I think I can speak for most Americans that, unlike some of our leaders, we don't view the EU as the #1 foe of America, as it was once described. In fact, we see the EU and Europe more broadly as an essential relationship for the United States going forward. And in the world that I come from, the Brookings Institution, we have sort of a shorthand for this. And we talk about the U.S. relationship with China as being probably the consequential relationship for the United States in the 21st century. That the relationship with India is probably the indispensable relationship. Great democracy and its economy is coming very fast. We have to reconcile the relationship with Russia. It is a hostile relationship and an adversarial relationship now, and we're going to have to find our way forward with that. But we are very clear that the essential relationship for the United States going forward is the relationship with Europe, the transatlantic relationship, and as a part of that, the transatlantic alliance. And so we're very concerned about the health of the EU at any given time. We recognize the battering that it has taken as a result, not just of American policy, but also the result of Brexit. And Brexit has had its effect on, I think, the morale of the institution. But we, however that ends up, we hope that the institution comes through intact and sound. I'll make just a couple of other broad points and I'll turn it over to the professor. We are very concerned about Russia with respect to Europe and the Russian influence campaign that has in fact reached all the way into the United States as the recent results of the investigation by our special counsel was able to reveal. So we're very concerned about the aggregate long-term effects of the Russian strategic influence campaign on Europe. We're very interested and attentive to the emerging role of China in Europe. And one thing I'll say about China and the U.S. relationship with China is if you want to turn China into an enemy, treat China as an enemy. And I don't get up every morning believing that the Chinese are the enemy of the United States, although there are some who do. And the way we talk about a relationship with China at Brookings is seek opportunity. We talk about it in the context of 4 C's. Seek opportunity to cooperate. And there are enormous opportunities for the United States and more broadly the community of nations to cooperate with China at this particular moment. Expect that we're going to compete, and we are in fact competing largely now, but from competition seek opportunity, and in competition manage the next C, which is confrontation. And then above all other things, prevent conflict. And we've had these conversations with the Chinese, and there are many, many occasions and many opportunities for us to have constructive relations with the Chinese on a whole variety of areas, on medical research, on advanced technologies, on supercomputing, on artificial intelligence, on biotechnology, on space, importantly on climate. There are many ways which we can cooperate with them. But we also have to recognize that Chinese interests are going to extend well beyond East Asia. The Belt and Road Initiative is an enormously consequential strategic undertaking by the Chinese that will reach straight into Europe. And the question becomes, and I think Europe has to answer this question, in the aggregate, is that Chinese interest, is that Chinese activity in Europe part of an overarching strategic undertaking to create a strategic dominance, if you will? Or is it, in fact, simply an attempt to create constructive economic and political equilibrium with one of the most powerful multilateral organizations on the planet, frankly, the EU? And I think the jury's out on that. But we have to be open-minded and wide-eyed as we think about what the role of China will be in Europe. And I think the EU has done some very constructive thinking about that of late, so that the EU as a body thinks about it at the same time that there are bilateral relations developing. And I'll say one other thing, and that is that I think by the middle of the century, we will find that one of the most consequential areas on the planet will be Africa. And while there are those who worry that Africa, by the middle of the century, which could be 1/4 of the population of the planet, is a potential migration and immigration problem for Europe, I happen to believe, and I think this is where the United States and Europe and China could have enormous opportunities to cooperate on seeking opportunity in Africa by the middle of the century. The Chinese are deeply engaged there. They don't do it the way we would do it in terms of development and foreign assistance. We'll have to find a way, I think, where we can find common ground in that regard. But Africa, by the middle of this century, has enormous opportunity, and the United States and Europe and China have a rare opportunity to combine their capabilities and their interests to the betterment of those 54 countries on the continent. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Sure, Mahbubani, can you hear me? No. Is this okay? Yes. Kishore Mahbubani. So John Allen said the jury is still out on what the role of China can be in Europe. But he also said if you want to see China as an enemy, treat it as an enemy, right? There is a magazine which is widely distributed today where you wrote a very interesting article. You can always rely on Kishore for promotion. But
I just begun.
Yeah. It's a very interesting article, and your point is that what China threat? China is not a threat. This is all about American paranoia. So is the European Union also paranoid about China? Has the European Union lost it, as you would say?
First of all, let me join John in thanking Thierry de Montbrial for inviting us and for joining you for this magnificent celebration of IFRI. And I've long been an admirer and friend of Thierry and IFRI, and I'm very glad to be here to celebrate this occasion with you. Unlike John, I actually did study some French, but it was in 1973, 46 years ago, in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, when the city was being shelled every day. And I remember vividly my house, all the glass flying when a bomb dropped nearby, and of shrapnel entering the walls, and those were exciting days. So French for me then was a very exciting language. But unfortunately, 46 years went by and I haven't had time to use it, so that's why I'm speaking to you in English today. And yeah, you've raised some very big questions, and I'll answer it this way. First, I think we've got to be clear what is the global context we are operating in the 21st century. And here, my answer, as a sort of a factual answer, is that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And this is what I call a return to the norm, because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies in the world were always those of China and India. It's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and North America took off. So the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been an aberration. Now, all aberrations come to an end, so it's perfectly natural to see the return of China, India, and the rest of Asia. It's not a strange development. It's a normal development. What is abnormal is the speed at which it is happening. In the case of China, in PPP terms, in 1980, its GNP was less than 10% of the United States in 1980. By 2014, it had become bigger in purchasing power parity terms. And in nominal terms, in the year 2000, United States GNP was 8 times the size of China. Today is 1.5 times in 15 years. You can see how fast this is happening. So the question, therefore, is, what adjustments do you need to make to adapt to this new era? You can't carry on as before. Today, as I was flying over, I told myself that maybe a very simple analogy to use, since I was in the plane, if you have a group of passengers who are so used to sitting in the first-class cabin all the time, and a group of passengers sitting in the economy class all the time, and it so happens that the economy class passengers now have become richer and more prosperous than the people sitting in the first-class cabin. But the people in the first-class cabin say, I'm really sorry, I'm not leaving, you stay in economy class. And that, I hope, explains to you why the Asians are calling for changes in some key dimensions. I'll give you a simple example. Why is it so many years after the IMF was created, the head of the IMF must be European? Why is it so many years after the World Bank was created, the head of the World Bank must be American? This has got to change. So the good news here is that the new first-class arrivals want to work with the West. In fact, that's the theme of my book. Despite its title, Has the West Lost It? I'm glad the French edition has come out.
It's also in French.
That the rest of the world is actually very grateful to the West for sharing its wisdom with the rest of the world. Why, yeah, you can show them the French edition. Why is the rest of the world succeeded? Why, you know, I came from a very poor family in a very poor country. How have I gone from living in a family of 6 in a one-room flat to now living in a 6-room house, which you have seen, Sylvie? So what happened? Western education. Really amazing. It catapulted me away from extreme poverty to a position where I can come and now speak in IFRI. Thank you, Western education. So, but the thing is that once the world changes, the paradox is that the West is finding it very difficult to adjust to this world. So I have, you know, to deal with China, okay, the specific question, how would I recommend you deal with China? I would say be Machiavellian. I know Machiavelli is not a good word to use in polite company. So what do? The best way to constrain China as it emerges, and it will continue getting stronger and stronger, is to constrain China with multilateral rules and norms and institutions and processes. And this is why you're asking about Europe's role, Sylvie. Europe's historic destiny today is to be the #1 defender of multilateralism. And so when the Trump administration undermines the UN in many ways, Europe should say, no, you're wrong. The UN is what we need, and the UN serves Western interests. The UN is going to constrain China in the long run. But Europe, for whatever reason, is become very weak, has become very divided, has become internally obsessed. I don't know how much time your leaders spend on Brexit. I mean, why are you wasting all that time on Brexit? It's an inconsequential issue. There are far more fundamental changes happening in the world. How often do your leaders sit down and talk frankly among themselves and say, we know that the world of 2030, 2040, 2050 will be very different. So how do we adjust? What do we do strategically? What changes do we need to make? And here, just to give one illustration where I completely agree with John on Africa, I actually think the #1 challenge for Europe is going to be Africa. Because in 1950, your population was twice that of Africa. Today, Africa's population is more than twice of Europe. By 2100, Africa's population will be 10 times the size of Europe. You have a vested interest in the economic development of Africa. And I completely agree with John. Europe should take the lead and work with China and the United States and say, okay, let's have a tripartite partnership. Let's work together on Africa. It's a very simple, commonsensical idea. Name me one European leader who has proposed it. None.
Okay. There's a lot. Thank you very much, Kishore. There's a lot in what you said and in what John Allen said before you. You mentioned Brexit. John Allen, is this an inconsequential issue for us and for the United States, Brexit, in terms of security, for instance? I mean, do you think this weakens Europe? Does the United States still have this so-called special relationship? I mean, how are you going to
Well, I think that's one of the biggest
this?
issues that we face right now, and that is what will the United Kingdom look like as it exits the EU? What will be the blow to the economy? What will be the willingness of the British people ultimately to have both the relationship with Europe that made Europe stronger, even though it was troubled, that made Europe stronger, that gave Europe both economically, politically, and in a security sense, a far greater capacity than without the Brits. And of course, as they depart, They're taking one of the largest economies and the largest military, or one of the largest militaries in Europe, out of the European Union, which in some senses causes Europe to move towards a defense initiative of its own. And at what cost is that to NATO? Because the Brits are still in NATO. The United States is still committed to NATO. Canada is committed to NATO. And the aggregation of all of those states together and the common values that we hold are enormously important. But the potential creation of incoherence, if you will, in the European narrative because of Brexit is what I think worries us a lot. So we don't know what the bilateral relationship will look like. We still call it the special relationship, but it will be troubled for some time. And what does that mean in having left Europe? I think the EU is probably pretty solid still. We hope that it is. But is there going to be a next exit from the EU? And as the professor said, and I couldn't agree with him more, look, multilateralism is the way of the future. We're going to have multilateral organizations that can define themselves through common interests. And we talk about the West. And I made comments the other night at a NATO dinner in the United States on the 70th anniversary. I said it has never been solely about the West. It has always been a much bigger community of nations with shared values and commitments to democracy and the rule of law and human rights and equal rights. We should be seeking, as we move deeper into the century, to create those relationships in multilateral ways that can, in fact, engage China. And the professor uses the word, I think, restrain. I worry that, not with that term or the way you use it, but often Americans think that we can pursue a strategy of containment for China.
I think you said constrain rather than restrain.
But they're roughly the same from that context.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what he meant. Mm-hmm. But sometimes we still think, on my side of the pond, that China can be contained. Mm-hmm. And that's a failed strategy. We need to find a way forward, but it needs to be in a very precise multilateral way. Mm-hmm. So we watch what's happening in the EU, we watch what's happening in Europe, because in many respects, that's an enormously powerful multilateral organization that can be the basis for a larger organization as we go forward, this common values that we're looking for in a global multilateral organization.
Absolutely, but precisely talking about this model, this European model, and taking into account the environment we're working in at the moment with President Trump and China, whose initiatives don't look always so friendly. And you mentioned the 70th anniversary of NATO. There's this dream or this talk or this effort to build a European defense. So I would like to ask both of you, from where you sit, first, do you think that the United States can accommodate a European defense? Is this seen as, do you see it as a threat to NATO? Or do you consider this expression of strategic autonomy as something dangerous from Europe? And Kishore, do you believe this is possible? From Asia, and knowing Europe as you do you think this is a realistic endeavor? So maybe I will start with you.
Well, sure, I can understand where the initiative comes from. There was a moment early in this administration, when there was real concern about whether we would even stay in NATO. And then we might stay in NATO but might not honor Article 5 under certain circumstances. And the entire theory, the entire narrative about NATO is about Article 5. And it's only been invoked one time in the history of the 70 years of NATO, and that was when we were attacked on 9/11. And Americans ought to remember that. NATO isn't against anyone, as the Secretary General would say. NATO is for the defense of Europe. And that defense of Europe has had a logic and a narrative about it which has been a platform for the political unity and the economic integration that we have seen that has emerged as the EU. They're not the same, but there are enormous overlaps. And that security platform, with North America engaged with Europe in an unbreakable way, has created that basis for the transatlantic relationship and the emergence of the EU, which I think we should be very concerned about. But when the EU decides, not the EU necessarily, but a European theory of the case, decides that there needs to be a separate defense mechanism, my first and instant response is, at what cost to NATO? We don't view it as a threat. The United States should never feel threatened by Europe. But the question becomes, do we lose our focus and our attention on NATO if we try to build a parallel structure? But I can understand, given the rhetoric that has come out of Washington, how Europe and Europeans might be concerned that in the event of a real crisis, we might not come. My guess is we'll come. But the truth is, my view is, I think most Americans share this, a theory or a European logic to have a separate defense mechanism, we won't oppose it, but we'll simply say, at what cost to NATO?
And you know NATO very well from inside.
A bit.
Yes.
I'm going to make two contradictory points. The first point is that, and I want to emphasize this, is that we are living through a time of tremendous transition, okay? Future historians will look at our time and say, what an amazing amount of changes took place, say, even in the last 30 years. Now, at a time of great transition, it's actually good to have some institutions and processes remain in place because they give confidence. So I would say it's good for NATO to continue because it gives confidence to the members of NATO. And for example, in the case of East Asia, it's good that the United States has a strong defense alliance with Japan because that alliance with Japan creates stability and predictability and also prevents Japan from becoming a nuclear power. So that's good for the region. So I would say at one level, keep what has been working. Don't throw it away. By the second level, and this is my contradictory point, if you are trying to figure out how to deal with China, the big question is, what strategy is China going to adopt as it moves towards becoming, that's their goal, the #1 power in the world? Now, the Chinese studied very carefully the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they learned many lessons from it. But one of the biggest lessons they learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union was that the cardinal mistake the Soviet leaders made was to pay all the attention on the defense budget and not on the economy. So the Chinese, as you notice, are concentrating on developing their economy and not their defense budget. Now, their defense budget is the fastest growing defense budget in the world because as a constant percentage of China's GNP, China will have a fastest growing defense budget in the world. But at the same time, if you read Kissinger's book on China, I mean, he has a brilliant chapter up front, which I highly recommend to you, where he says, the Chinese actually believe, this is a 1,000 years tradition, the best way to win a battle is to not fight it. If you have to fight a battle, in some ways, you have lost it. So the Chinese don't believe that you have to use military weapons to gain advantage. And here, one of the things I'm really surprised by, and since I'm writing a book on US-China relations, I'm very puzzled. Why is it that, I think US has about 6,500 nuclear weapons, I think. Russia has about 6,000. China has, how many?
The vast majority of the weapons are in the US.
Yeah. China has got 300. Why is it an economy that, is 2/3 the size or more of the American economy has nuclear missiles that are less than 10% of the United States? What is the signal that 300 number is giving you? The signal is giving you is that there will be no war. In the long run, the geopolitical contests will be determined on what they call, probably to use a Marxist term, comprehensive correlation of forces. And the Chinese, and I can take the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is partly driven by economics. It's also driven by a very careful long-term strategy of creating interdependence with the Chinese economy. And once you create interdependence with the Chinese economy, you got to listen to China. So their strategy, unlike when you see what happens in European election cycles or American election cycles, they're not focused on the next 2 to 4 years. Next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And they have that time horizon. So it's important, if you want to, in a sense, focus on the defense question, ask yourself, what is the Chinese military strategy and how do we combat it?
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, this is not a panel about China. Otherwise, I would like to ask you many, many questions, including we could talk about what is the Chinese strategy in the South China Sea. But this would bring us maybe too far, take us too far from our subject, which is Europe. So Europe, the EU and China yesterday had another summit, and it seems to have brought some results. So I wanted to ask you about this strategy. I mean, recently the EU seemed to get his act together on China and decided that it was, called it a systemic rival. And what do you think about this approach? Do you think it is the right approach, or do you think China would still feel threatened by this? Kishore, Mahbubani first.
Well, let me give you some shocking news. China doesn't feel threatened by Europe. Not at all. In fact, frankly, from the point of view of a Chinese long-term strategic planner, Europe is a great opportunity. Seriously. In economic terms, it's a great opportunity, because if you're looking for economic growth partners, Europe is a great partner. If you're looking for a potential partner in Africa, it makes sense to partner Europe. And at the same time, the Chinese understand nuances, in a very amazing way. And they understand that despite the very close transatlantic alliance that you have between the United States and Europe, that you do see the world differently in Europe from the way you see the world in Washington, D.C. They understand these differences. And from their point of view, if Europe keeps on pushing for multilateral rules and processes, it's not necessarily bad for China. And I'll give you one concrete example, okay? The number one challenge we face, as we know in the world today, and we haven't mentioned it at all, is climate change. And clearly, Europe has been the leader in dealing with climate change, right? Intellectual leadership, the Paris agreements. Now, the Chinese could have backtracked from the Paris agreements when President Trump walked away from them. They could have said, hang on a second. This greenhouse gas emissions were put up by the Western Industrial Revolution. Why should we pay the price for it if the United States doesn't want to pay the price? But they decided very wisely that China is going to be affected too. And by the way, India also didn't backtrack. Both China and India didn't backtrack from the climate change agreements. So when you look at global issues like this, like climate change, Europe is a very important partner. So they would rather work with Europe on these kinds of global issues. And even, I would say, for example, on the World Trade Organization, which is something I think the Chinese want to preserve, they see Europe also as a potential ally on the World Trade Organization. So there are issues on which they see that Europe can be a partner. And even if you call them a systemic rival, they will ignore the words that you use.
And General, we see the United States re-engaging in some parts of Europe where China is very active, namely Central Europe. There's this 16+1 framework where we see China being quite aggressive. Is this a concern for you?
It is. And the professor made the point. Sun Tzu, the great Chinese general, and we obviously have studied it, Europe studies it, said the greatest general wins the battles without having to fight. And so the point that was made just a few moments ago was that Belt and Road Initiative, development activities in Africa and South America, they create economic relationships. They can create then economic dependency, which then creates political, a limitation on political discretion. And so the whole point about whether we should anticipate a military conflagration with the Chinese, I think is much less, to me, much less likely than that we'll wake up one morning and many of our partners, after an extended period of time of economic engagement, will find themselves with far less political discretion as individual members within multilateral organizations, and thus those organizations are weakened from within. And I think that that's a very logical strategy to pursue. This is what concerns us. This is why I said the jury is still out as we watch Chinese activity in Europe. It can in fact be the legitimate intent to create an economic and political equilibrium with a very powerful trading partner. But it could in fact be the leading edge of a long-term strategy to create economic and eventually political dependencies at a bilateral level, which in the end reduces the cohesion and the coherence and the trajectory of the European Union, winning without having to fight. Yeah. And I think that we need to be watching this very closely, so I applaud the EU's skepticism in that regard and their eyes wide open approach to the relationship with China.
Thank you very much. We only have a couple of minutes left, and we haven't mentioned Russia. So I would like to ask each of you very briefly to conclude this session by your view of how the EU should deal with Russia, or how do you see Russia's attitude towards Europe or in Europe? I know it's a tough question for 1 minute.
Well, I think we know what Russia's attitude is towards Europe. In many respects, I think Russia sees the EU potentially as the greater threat than NATO. A coherent, massive European market, a large population base, democracies that stand for common values that we can all agree to. If you're able to create the political circumstances that cause drifts in liberal democracy towards illiberalism, and you can begin to break down the cohesion, as I know the EU worries about, as we see some of those states begin to drift towards illiberal democracy. That, in effect, has the outcome of beginning to dissipate the cohesion of the EU, from my perspective. And that's something we worry about a lot. I think NATO has the right kind of mentality that sees the Russians as an adversary and takes the steps necessary to defend Europe from that adversary. But NATO is only as strong as the political will of its members, and if that political will is beginning to drift, or if the political will is becoming inchoate, then we have a problem, and in fact it works to the Russians' advantage.
Do you agree, Kishore?
Well, if I was a Russian strategic planner thinking about the long-term threat to Russia, I don't think I worry anymore about Napoleon or Hitler invading Moscow anymore. What I would worry about is China's rise. Russia has got the longest border with China. And China used to be, in relatively speaking, more or less the same, as powerful as the Soviet Union, or less powerful. Today, China is so much more powerful than Russia. The number one nightmare for a Russian planner is China. In the long run, I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen. But Russia is going to move towards Europe and possibly even United States to balance China.
Very good. So this is an exciting vision. Thank you very much to the two of you.